Across our planet, almost everything we depend on for daily life, every comfort, convenience, and miracle of modern society, we can trace back to one monumental discovery. A discovery which proved to be the most inexpensive, plentiful, and versatile resource in the history of our civilization. It has raised the carrying capacity of the Earth, rescued us from the oppressive darkness of night, spared millions from starvation and disease, extended life expectancies, created entire new economies, and unleashed fantastic technological advances we once only dreamed of. It has acted as humanity's planet-issued credit card, allowing us to rack up tremendous progress in a handful of generations, to reach for the stars, and even create our own forms of intelligence that challenge the very nature of what it means to be human. But like all credit cards, this one has a limit. And the bill's about to come due.
Using the magic of research, oil companies compete with each other in taking the petroleum molecule apart and rearranging it into, well, you name it, fabrics, toothbrushes, tires, insecticides, cosmetics, weed killers, a whole galaxy of things to make a better life on Earth.
The age of petroleum is wholly aligned with the age of the middle class, the age of rising living standards and technology, the age of the American dream. Reliable supplies of dirt-cheap fossil fuels are responsible for everything we've been identifying as the luxuries and even commodities of modern life. And still today, all these necessities and comforts, air conditioning, cars, airplanes, cheap clothing, movies, power tools, supermarkets, in one way or another, we owe the existence of all of them to cheap fossil fuels, especially oil.
Invest $1 and you get back 25,000 hours of human labor. That's an energy source that is so dense, it's essentially free energy.
It's all non-renewable, it's all extremely capital intensive, and it's probably the most invaluable natural resource we've ever discovered.
Oil and natural gas are what gave us plastic, detergents, resins, nylon, polyester, adhesives, dyes, rubbers, lubricants, gels, and thousands of industrial chemicals found everywhere, the building blocks of our modern global-scale consumer economy. Even our systems of farming and agriculture are hopelessly dependent on oil to operate at their current scale. Oil-powered machines are used to till, plant, irrigate, fertilize, dust with pesticides, harvest, and transport nearly all of the food we eat. But you probably already considered that the main component you owe to oil would be your car. That if only we could swap out our fleet of personal automobiles with cars that ran on clean, renewable energy, we'd be spared. But there are no cars without oil. It literally makes building them possible, regardless of what fuels them. There are countless gallons of oil used to manufacture a single car. There is oil used to make the plastics and the paints, oil used to heat the metals. It takes 7 gallons of oil to make one tire. Then there's oil used to ship the cars to a dealership or even to load onto a vehicle carrier ship to send to other countries. Even hybrid and electric cars are still made from the same components. They still need tires. They still need dashboards and radios and plastic peripherals. And they too must have all these requirements met with petroleum products. This is to make no small mention of the oil used in building and maintaining the asphalt roads on which we drive these cars. We obviously don't rely solely on the personal automobile for transportation and commerce. Trucking, international shipping, and airline travel are all impossible without oil, as are extracting and refining all of the rare minerals and non-renewable elements to make fancy things like solar panels, LED screens, microchips, cell phones, and electrical wires and cables. Every single component that goes into manufacturing and distributing the products and services we depend on is impossible to reproduce without the use of oil. Without these components, our economy and our society begin contracting, and this drastic shift in our standard of living is going to be a big surprise to millions of Americans. Our citizens are unable to fathom the shockwaves that will ripple through every aspect of daily life, caused by a radical reduction in the availability of fossil fuels in a system specifically designed to depend on them. You can't have 4,700 Walmarts, 40,000 grocery stores, 27 billion pounds of beef a year, 15 million semi-trucks, 279 million automobiles, 164,000 miles of highway maintained, Walt Disney World, a space program. None of this is sustainable, and none of it is even remotely possible absent the credit card we call fossil fuels. An economy that is entirely fueled by a combination of renewable energy is vastly different, vastly smaller, and vastly more local than the one we have come to take for granted for decades. Unfortunately, a society arranged the way ours is, built on the premise of inexpensive and infinitely available energy, is nearly impossible to downscale or retrofit in the time we have left to attempt to do it. It's also a society we're going to have to prepare ourselves for, as the age of fossil fuels is coming to an end.
Most people, when they think about oil, think of when we're going to run out. And really that's the wrong question to ask, because oil in the earth is not like gasoline in the gas tank of your car. When your car runs out of gas, then you know there's a problem. But with oil in the earth, it's a very different situation.
Perhaps you've heard mention of the concept of peak oil. Perhaps not. Peak simply means we've recovered half of the total amount of a non-renewable resource that has ever and will ever exist. After that point, no matter how great our financial or energy investment, we will never be able to increase production more than where it was at the peak.
All oil production, whether it's in one oil field or one country or the planet as a whole, always follows a bell curve. When you drill your first well, if the oil's close to the surface under pressure, you get a gusher. You drill more wells, the pressure goes down, the table goes down. But also you're pumping out the light sweet oil, which has risen to the top. The heavier, more expensive oil to refine, the harder to get oil, is obviously way down deep.
And you have to start pumping in water or carbon dioxide or natural gas if you've got some around, and start forcing the oil out. So what you get is this curve. It starts, pulls up quite quickly, you get more and more and more out, then you reach this peak or plateau.
When you get to about the halfway point, the rate that you can extract the resource peaks. And after that point, no matter how much effort you put into it, you can't continue extracting the resource at the same rate. The rate of extraction peaks and begins to fall.
Since all oil wells follow an identical production curve, we can likewise map a similar curve to the planet's oil resources as a whole. Back in 1956, after spending 20 years with the Shell Oil Company, geologist and geophysicist M. King Hubbert came up with a set of equations to accurately predict how much oil one could expect to produce from any given well.
Very few people took him seriously, in spite of the fact that he was so universally respected. Of course, U.S. oil production did in fact peak in 1970-71, and as a result of that, a few more people started to take him seriously.
Peaking means categorically that you no longer grow. It's one of these phenomena that you only can say that with phenomenal. Yes, we are sure when you look back in a rearview mirror, but usually by the time it's clear, it's so far in the past, you're well into a totally different era.
Hubbert accurately predicted that the United States would reach peak oil production by 1970, and then continue to gradually decline, which it did. until around 2008. What happened next? We'll get to that in a minute. For now, let's go to the other side of the planet.
East and West are united in pioneering a new frontier of progress, serving the interest of the Saudi Arabs, serving the interest of the United States, and demonstrating the vitality of the American system of free enterprise.
The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has historically been the planet's most important producer of oil. It is the de facto leader of OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, which accounts for 79% of the world's oil reserves and about 40% of all oil production. It is also home to the largest oil field ever known, Ghawar, a 300-mile-long slice of land discovered in 1948 that accounts for 60% of all the oil ever produced in the kingdom. Since 1982, Saudi Arabia has consistently kept all data related to its reserves a highly protected state secret. We don't know, and we may never know, how much oil was and is there, but we do know the largest oil field ever discovered in the last 70 years is producing less and less.
OPEC countries do not care about what might happen from now, 20 years from now, or 30 years, or 40 years from now. They care about what they get now, today. Because these are politicians, they want more money. 20 years from now, by that time they are dead. They don't care.
In 2018, the International Energy Agency released its World Energy Outlook report and predicted that global oil production would continue to decline at a rate of 8% every year. If no new oil deposits are discovered and exploited, in just 6 years, production will be 24 million barrels per day below where demand is expected to be. This is a huge hole of over 35% of all the oil that is currently produced. The IEA explains in their report that to avoid that hole, we would need to find around 16 billion barrels per year, every year, even though for the last 15 years we've only managed to find an average of 9. Since the very first oil well was drilled over 160 years ago, the planet has been thoroughly explored, especially when it comes to the resource that above all others is responsible for making industrial civilization possible. Discovery of new oil sources is at the lowest point it's ever been since 4 years after Ghawar was discovered, and after peaking in 1964, is now over 7 times lower than worldwide consumption. Oil is our planet's most critical resource. Without it, no part of industrial civilization works as it is currently arranged. On the other side of the peak, there is very real potential for all varieties of system failures. Social, economic, and political. It is quite literally a tipping point. Beyond it, things unravel. Industrial society cannot be easily brought back to center, and all bets are off about civilization's future. But what about that earlier, odds-defying point in time when U.S. oil production stopped declining? Did we actually turn a corner?
The United States of America cares about the price of gasoline, then we better get after finding some supplies of oil and gas. So I signed an executive order that said, why don't we explore for oil and gas offshore? If we've got a problem with not having enough oil, let's go after some oil right here in the United States of America in environmentally friendly ways. There was an executive order blocking that. I signed an executive order that unblocked it.
Early in 2018, the U.S. Energy Information Administration reported that the United States surpassed the 1970 peak and managed to produce over 10 million barrels a day. By early 2019, it was up to 12 million. We've seen that 2008 was the turning point that saw the U.S. immensely ramp up its production. But how was it possible to deviate so drastically from Hubbard's curve? That year, fueled by rising gas prices, President George W. Bush lifted the executive order preventing offshore drilling along much of the nation's coasts. 2 years later, in March of 2010, President Obama announced that he would open up huge swaths of previously protected coastline for offshore drilling, including areas along the Atlantic, the eastern Gulf of Mexico, and even northern Alaska.
So today we're announcing the expansion of offshore oil and gas exploration. We'll employ new technologies that reduce the impact of oil exploration. We'll protect areas that are vital to tourism, the environment, and our national security. And we'll be guided not by political ideology, but by scientific evidence.
The latest on the search for 11 missing crewmen from a spectacular oil rig explosion in the Gulf of Mexico.
Do you have information now that this rig has gone under?
It has gone under the surface at about 10:21 this morning. Coast Guard got word that the vessel has gone under.
If this goes on for several more weeks, if not a few more months, would this be the worst environmental disaster ever?
The very next month, the Deepwater Horizon oil rig exploded, causing the largest accidental oil spill in history and pouring over 1 million gallons of oil a day into the Gulf for 87 days. Aside from accidental spills, production from offshore wells has to shut down during tropical storms and hurricanes, which, due to our climate change predicament, are becoming more powerful and more frequent. This further adds to the costly nature of attempting to exploit unconventional sources of oil. The enormous investments in the form of cost, energy, and risk associated with offshore drilling clearly illustrated what was already plain for the oil industry and energy experts to see, that American conventional oil sources were declining and would never recover. The 2008 financial crisis also helped another oil production phenomenon occur: shale oil. In the decade after the crisis, the Federal Reserve kept interest rates unnaturally low, allowing for extremely cheap financing. Billions in low-interest borrowing, combined with skyrocketing demand for oil and gas at soaring prices, created a feeding frenzy for eager Wall Street investors, and shale companies promised huge returns on investment. In the shale formations, oil doesn't flow through the rock. It's literally trapped and requires a process known as hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, to release it. This process requires transporting huge amounts of fresh water with diesel-powered trucks, blasting the rock using tremendous pressure, then injecting sand and hundreds of gallons of petrochemicals. The fluids and sand hold open the small cracks in the rock, and the oil can slowly seep through. On average, this consists of 8 million liters of water, enough to supply the daily water consumption of 65,000 people.
Fracking will buy us some time on the energy side of the story. There's a lot of other reasons that people are rightly concerned about fracking. We're getting more information about it all the time. First thing fracking allows you to do is to tap all sorts of new hydrocarbons that hadn't been factored into many of the calculations for how much carbon we were going to be putting in the atmosphere. There are all these externalities of ruined roads and other infrastructure damage that are not being recouped at the state level in Pennsylvania and Texas because of the damage these heavy fracking trucks are doing. And then there are the water issues. Obviously, if you live in a dry, arid region of Texas, there's just not the water sufficient to both have a town well and fracking going at the same time.
A shale well and all of its fracking operations cost around 15 times more than a conventional well, yet consistently produce lower daily flows and very rapid rates of diminishing returns, with much shorter time periods between production, peak, and decline. And since over 60% of all new oil and gas wells are drilled using fracking, more and more regions are hitting their decline. Shale is also far less versatile in terms of the finished products it can create, and there's only so much that can be used. It isn't particularly good at yielding heavier distillates, used in things like diesel fuel, and there are no refineries specifically built to be able to handle it. So why haven't oil companies built any? Perhaps more than any other unconventional oil, shale is energy intensive, costly, harder to refine, less versatile, has more environmental risks, and is depleted extremely quickly. The shale boom immediately sent drilling costs skyrocketing. The enormous borrowing and investment in specialized shale refineries could take decades to pay back, if at all. And the industry knows that shale oil production will simply not be able to continue that far into the future. U.S. shale companies now face declining production, rising costs, and unserviceable debts. Over 200 shale companies have filed for bankruptcy as falling oil prices and lower demand, made infinitely worse by the coronavirus pandemic, have completely disrupted the industry. They are quite literally hitting the bottom of the barrel, the last dregs of recoverable oil, providing another decade or so of business-as-usual consumption, or as one independent oil analyst put it, a retirement party for the oil industry. It's a last gasp effort that's keeping the world afloat, as the United States now holds the title of the world's #1 exporter of oil. But peak oil didn't cease to exist. It was merely rescheduled. Conventional production peaked over a decade ago. Unconventional oil is an unsustainable model whose time will eventually run out. It has had the regrettable side effect of convincing the public and many politicians that we had finally become energy independent and bought ourselves plenty of time to seamlessly transition away from fossil fuels, rescue our deteriorating climate, and maintain our current standard of living. It was an illusion. You wouldn't think energy and the environment, things that are bound to the laws of physics and biology, would become a partisan issue. But the two main political parties, which have unfortunately become two tribal factions of a single nation, have vastly different and equally ineffective approaches to these challenges.
Drill, baby, drill, and drill now. Drill, baby, drill.
Production on government land of oil is down 14%, and production on gas is down 9%.
It's just not true.
It's absolutely true.
We have we have found over the last 7 years, we have found tremendous wealth right under our feet. So good. But we are putting our energy companies out of business.
Remember I said, well, you want to get rid of oil and gas? Is that, yeah, well, we want to phase it out. I said, thank you, Texas, are you watching?
Conservative leaders, envisioning a future of American energy dominance, want to heavily invest in every last sweet spot we can exploit to keep business-as-usual consumption going, all while downplaying or even outright denying the effects of anthropogenic climate change and environmental pollution. The concern over job loss and diminishing economic growth is fueling their push to expand and prop up domestic fossil fuel production, most notably in expensive and less productive offshore and shale regions. But proponents of American energy dominance are simply attempting to buy more time and postpone an inevitable collapse of the industry. Conversely, on the left, you'll regularly hear grandiose proposals about a green economy, a Green New Deal, carbon neutrality, the wholesale abandonment of fossil fuels, followed by a so-called transition to 100% renewable energy, an ambitious and noble aspiration for the sake of our planet.
You're talking about zero carbon emissions, no use of fossil fuels within 12 years?
That is the goal. It's ambitious. And
how is that possible? You're talking about everybody having to drive an electric car?
It's going to require a lot of rapid change that we don't even conceive as possible right now.
We are going to get rid of fossil fuels. We are going to have to stand up to the fossil fuel industry. We're going to have to transform our energy system and energy systems all over the world away from fossil fuel to energy efficiency and sustainable energy.
One, we have to encourage that those industries do better in terms of giving the workers an ability to transition into the jobs of the future, such as renewable energy.
But be it through peak supply, peak demand, or legislative action outright outlawing fossil fuel production and emissions, there is no combination of affordable and scalable alternatives that will allow us to continue consuming, continue growing our economy, and maintain our comfortable way of life. They know it, and they aren't telling you. When did you last hear a major politician afford the American people the dignity of having an honest discussion about confronting these very real challenges? Challenges which are coming whether we like them or not. Challenges which will force us to fundamentally alter our most crucial systems, built on top of other even more complex systems, from employment to urban planning, to our shared climate, to the quality and availability of the food we eat. No one wants to admit that as the expectation of immense amounts of energy can't be met, each of these interconnected systems will begin to fail and spread to the next. Most of the public is simply going to be unable to entertain the reality that industrial civilization cannot be extricated from these dire circumstances by human ingenuity or technological innovation. Future generations are likely to view the fossil-fed age of the last century and a half as a single luminous blip in the history of our planet, what many of us see as our birthright, an entitlement to limitless growth, ever-advancing technology, and unending progress, was perhaps simply a fluke, a one-time bargain made between humankind and our environment, unable to be duplicated again. If we want to save our planet and our civilization, we're going to have to massively retool, downsize, and reorganize almost every aspect of our society on a timeline and scale that has never been done before in human history.
You know, unfortunately, history is tragic, and history doesn't care if we're incompetent. History doesn't care if we make blunders. History doesn't care if we're sloppy. History doesn't care if we don't pay attention. You know, reality has mandates of its own. And, you know, we're going to find out the hard way that what the cost of not paying attention is.
Ultimately, we have failed at setting up our civilization in a sustainable way to leave behind a consistent quality of life for future generations. We have maxed out our lines of credit with no retirement plan, and are entering the twilight years of what was the Indian summer of human civilization, a period of inexpensive and abundant energy, responsible for unforeseen technological advancement. We tragically lost sight of the fact that these extraordinary gifts from our planet exist in finite and non-renewable supplies. The miraculous nature of our technological supremacy has made us believe we can simply engineer our way out of any crisis using the very gifts that are causing it. That with enough ingenuity and leadership, we can merely impose a seamless transition from fossil fuels to their supposed replacements and be on our merry way. The idea that we can maintain business as usual for some 8 billion people while continuing to grow both economies and populations towards some zero-emission, meta-industrial, post-carbon utopia is a dangerously counterproductive fantasy, and it's just not going to happen. In this series, we'll examine all the areas of our life which are going to change, which inherently have to change, including every cascading crisis that will be piling on in the wake of our failed industrial experiment. Where we'll live, how we'll eat, how we'll get around, what our climate will look like, and what you can do to make sure you'll be able to find your place on our long descent.
Stand tall for the beast of America. Lay down like a naked dead body. Keep it real for the people working overtime. They can't stay living off the government's dime. Stand tall for the people of America. Stand tall for the man next door. We are free in the land of America. We ain't going down like this. Come on now.